to put mothers and fathers in the same bucket and talk about parents just didn't make any sense. And it actually, I really felt that it was undermining advocacy that was really important at the time.
Hi, I'm Jane.
I'm Karleen.
And I'm Bex.
And we are
Insightful Sisters.
Hello, everybody. So we're very excited tonight. I'm really looking forward to this episode. We've got Dr. Karleen Gribble with us. She's adjunct, I hope I've pronounced that right, Associate Professor at the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Western Sydney University. So we're going international tonight. She's written extensively about infant feeding, particularly about breastfeeding during periods of adversity. And that really brought her into studying language and the impact that language has. So hello, Karleen. I'm going to pass you across to Bex because she's got our first questions, but it's so lovely to have you here.
Thanks so much, Jane.
Perfect. So yeah, as Jane mentioned there, obviously you're looking at infant feeding and the language we use around motherhood and breastfeeding. Here in the UK and in America, we see a lot of capture in academia. How is it there? Can you just give us some sort of background of the culture within academics?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think it's interesting because I'm in a school of nursing and midwifery, and there hasn't been a lot of change, I've got to say, in terms of academics. So most of the midwifery academics about the place, they will be talking about women and mothers and breastfeeding. I think, though, if you go into some other areas of academia, you're going to see very different things. So really, I think for people who are, professionals who are dealing with, women and their bodies, mostly they're pretty focused on, the women that they're looking after, and they use the language that works best for those women, and also understanding that you need to use clear language when you're communicating generally. Yeah, it has been not too terrible.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, how did you first become aware of the issues happening on a broader scale, or the push towards non-gendered language around motherhood and midwifery?
Yeah, well, I first noticed it about 2014, 15, that this was starting to come through, and very much that this was something that was happening in the US or Canada as well, probably, and that this was something that was proposed for the sort of language that you would use on a one-to-one basis with people who didn't want their sex being referred to, essentially. So women who identified as being trans men or as non-binary, although non-binary wasn't so much of a thing back then, that you would use different language with them. And I think, generally speaking, people didn't object to that, because that's kind of, when it comes to what's called person-centered care, which is, you provide healthcare to the individual, using language that people prefer is pretty normal. And so that just wasn't seen as being something very difficult. But as time went on, and particularly during the pandemic, so particularly in 2021, there was pressure to change language. So although I said, in my university and with my colleagues, that's not really been an issue, a lot of the work that I do has been with international organisations, and there was a lot of pressure in 2020 within those organisations to change language, and language was being changed. So over 2020, we saw organisations start at the beginning of the year talking about women and breastfeeding mothers, pregnant women and breastfeeding mothers. And by the end of the year, they were talking about pregnant people and breastfeeding parents. So, it was a really obvious and quite fast shift in 2020.
Do you have any sort of theories about what caused it to happen at that particular moment? Was this COVID?
I think it had sort of reached a bit of a tipping point, but I think COVID was like pouring fuel on lots of fires. And so I think that was a factor there as well. So it was also the point at which I said, no, this can't continue. This is terrible. And particularly because of my work in a lot of my work is around infant and young child feeding in emergencies and breastfeeding in emergencies. And we had the unfortunate situation where the American government put out guidance right at the beginning of COVID suggesting that if mothers were infected, new mothers were infected, that they should be separated from their newborn babies. And that guidance spread around the world, causing an enormous amount of harm. And so we were having that terrible thing was coming from the US. And then we were also having pressure from the US to no longer talk about mothers. And so even when we're having mothers and babies separated in numbers that we'd never seen before in the world, we were also having people say we couldn't even say who this person was that was so important to the baby. We couldn't even say, they didn't want to say mother, they were talking about parents. And it's like, it actually doesn't matter to a newborn baby whether they're separated from their father. They don't need them. So it might be distressing for the father to be separated from their baby, but the baby doesn't care, actually. And so to put mothers and fathers in the same bucket and talk about parents just didn't make any sense. And it actually, I really felt that it was undermining advocacy that was really important at the time to say, actually, first of all, there's not evidence that you need to separate mothers from their newborns if the mothers have COVID. And second of all, we need to be able to say who this person is. She's not just a parent, she's actually the mother. She just gave birth to this baby. They're really important to one another. We should keep them together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the clarity of that language is so important. How did you find the response within academics, but on a wider level as well, when you started to speak up?
Well, it was very difficult because I was aware of, and you could not be aware of just how volatile the situation was, and that saying, if you were saying, no, we need to talk about mothers, we need to talk about pregnant women, that there were people who would essentially go after you. There's some really aggressive criticism of people, and I didn't have this happen, but people were having letters of complaint go to their universities. They were having people doing all sorts of things. And sometimes universities were paying attention to that and people were getting treated terribly badly. So it was quite, I felt I really needed to get my head around what was this issue? What were the actual solutions? What were the problems? What were the solutions? And what did we need to be thinking about? And that was in 2021. I got together a group of colleagues and from all sort of relevant areas in maternity, so obstetrics, midwifery, nutrition, breastfeeding, neonatology, and we wrote a paper outlining what we saw as being the issues and got that published. And the reason why I did it that way was I thought, if you come out and say something small, then people are going to attack you. But if I'm able to put out the whole case, then people may actually attack me, but what I actually mean can't be misconstrued. So we really wanted to put out the sort of the full argument all at once. And so that paper was published in early 2022. So that was kind of it was interesting, really. It felt like I was approaching people, and most of my co-authors on that paper I didn't know before. And I think only one of them I'd ever actually written anything with. And I was kind of saying, will you jump with me into the void?
Yeah. Oh,
Come
God.
on, let's write something extremely controversial. You don't really know me. I don't really know you. But let's see if we can work together and make something. And yes, I was fortunate that all those people did say, yep, okay, let's do it. So
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of reasons back at that time that people would be sort of suspicious or unwilling to. But I imagine having a joined front where a group of you came forward together and really got into your argument about why this is so important. I can imagine that did help, even just in an emotional way behind the scenes, to know that this wasn't something you were doing alone and that you had other people to talk through it with.
Well, I know there were lots and lots and lots of people who were concerned, but also
Yeah.
just scared. I mean, the fact that avoiding referring to sex has been described as, or the term that's used to describe it is inclusive language. It's like, well, who wants to argue against being inclusive? Nobody, of course. The fact of the matter is that it's not very inclusive. Like this language isn't very inclusive at all. It is, if you're trying to communicate about something where sex is really important, and like pregnancy, you can't get anybody who's pregnant is female, and if you're trying to avoid making reference to that, then you end up with language that is really unclear and confusing. And so the cost is quite high. I mean, it's quite obvious to see, and we included lots of examples of this in our paper. But if there are people who are saying, no, well, you're not being inclusive, in fact, you're being an evil bigot, then it's difficult for people to go, okay, I wasn't meaning to be awful. But when you have hordes of people come down upon you for saying something or doing something, it's very difficult. So yeah, I don't think I could have done it by myself. And I certainly couldn't have written the paper because it was very much a joint effort, and my co-authors are amazing people. So we worked together really well, I think, to produce something that has been useful to others. So yeah.
That's great. I'm going to pass to Jane. She's going to talk to you a bit more about the importance of language.
Sure.
That was fascinating. So the language, it just fascinates me, this, because we change language for particular reasons, don't we? We change language to, like you said, avoid offending people and to be kind to people and so on. Can you give us some examples of some of the words that were used that were particularly irritating, offensive to you?
Egregious, maybe, even.
Egregious is a good word.
Look, I mean, there's been so many. Some of the alternative words that people have used have just been like quite innocuous in and of themselves, but nonetheless confusing. So if you replace women with people, of course, you're including both sexes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you replace mothers with parents, then you're including both parents. So you get more sort of lack of specificity when you do that. But other terms that refer, particularly the ones that refer to body parts or physiological processes, I mean, they're just dehumanizing and offensive.
Mm.
So terms like, I think one I saw this morning even was people with a vulva, or yes.
As if
But
it's
also,
an additional accessory.
yes, I don't know. Oh, well, you can also be a vulva owner. So
Oh,
I'm not
okay.
quite
Yeah.
sure where you go and buy them, but you get them somewhere.
Presumably a vulva dealership.
Perhaps. Then there's also terms like menstruators. I mean, that's another one that is not uncommonly, I mean, the vulva owner one is unusual, but menstruators is not unusual at all. Like that's quite commonly being used. And then there are terms that are sort of replacements for breastfeeding, so test feeding or body feeding or human milk feeding are all terms that will be used, or lactating actually will be used as replacements for breastfeeding. And so when you do that, so for example, replacing breastfeeding with human milk feeding, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean breastfeeding. And increasingly, what we're seeing, particularly in high-income countries, but increasingly in middle-income countries as well, as women are using breast pumps to express breast milk and feed it to their babies using a bottle. Now, that's a good way of getting, or it can be a good way of getting milk into a baby if the mother isn't able to breastfeed because they're separated or because there's problems with feeding, and it's a helpful thing until that problem can be overcome. But some women are just expressing milk and bottle feeding it to their babies, and it's not the same thing.
No.
It's not the same thing for the baby. It's not the same thing for the mother-infant relationship. It's more difficult than breastfeeding. It means that babies get breast milk for a shorter period of time. And so if you just replace breastfeeding with human milk feeding, well, of course, the mother disappears. There's no relationship.
No.
You know, it's just providing milk to a baby. It's not that interaction and connection and closeness and physical proximity that's required for breastfeeding. So quite a lot is lost there.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a marvellous thing, breastfeeding, the way that that relationship between the mother and baby, you're almost one, and you're producing exactly what they need at that particular time, the antibodies in response to any illness that they have and so on. It's such a marvellous thing, and you presumably can't do that if you're expressing milk, and you certainly can't do it if you're a man making some hormone-induced gup. I don't know what else to call it.
Well, it is milk, which is another controversial thing to say. But there are a whole heap of other issues associated with that. And in fact, I've got a paper on that subject that's about to be submitted. So
Excellent.
I won't say any more. People can read it when it's published.
We'll wait with bated breath. That's very interesting. But the language choices, they really tell us how the mother or the woman is viewed, don't they? In terms of, like you said, her body parts or her function, her usefulness.
Yeah, I think language to refer to mothers is really important. Particularly, some of my areas of work have really been in situations where mothers are very marginalised and have had a very difficult time. And there are some contexts where people will go to all sorts of lengths to avoid using the word mother because of the meaning that it holds. And that's significant in this area because if you lose the word mother, then you lose a lot of power. So I'll give you some examples. I've done some research looking at the experiences of women who haven't been able to have care of their children because of child protection concerns. And I interviewed a mother for a study whose children were all in, I think you call them looked after in the UK. And she had an intellectual disability, and there was a real reason why she couldn't care for her children. But she told me about how a social worker in front of one of her daughters said to her, "You are not a mother to your children. You were just an incubator." And it's like
Wow.
they didn't want to use that term. And you see this particularly in surrogacy, where people will go to all sorts of lengths to avoid referring to the woman who gestated and birthed the baby as a mother. And it's because of what the term means. And so if you lose that word, and so I'll give an example that happened in New Zealand. A women's prison was being shut, and it was going to mean that all of the women in those prisons were going to have to go into a different prison, which was like 7 or 8 hours travel away. And Amnesty International in New Zealand was advocating against the closure of this prison because it would involve the separation of those mothers from their children. But they didn't use the word mother. They talked about not separating the people in the prison from their family. And it's like, you have just actually, again, it's one of those situations where if a parent is imprisoned, it's an enormously different thing for the child if it's their mother versus their father. Enormously different. And you've lost all the power to advocate for those mothers and children by avoiding using the word mother and just talking about people. So, yeah, I think if the principle with language that we talked about in our paper, and I think is a good one, is that if the sex of the people involved in whatever it is important, then you should refer to their sex. And if their sex isn't important, don't.
No.
So we don't need to talk about policemen because there are policemen and there are police women, but we can just say police officers because their sex isn't important. But if you're talking about pregnancy and new motherhood, it really does matter.
Yeah, I mean, it must be one of the first words that human beings ever spoke.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, they do actually propose that. And it's certainly it's a concept that every language has a word for as well.
And some of them are quite similar, aren't they?
They are, yeah. So variations with the ma sound all over the world, very different languages, very different roots of languages. So I know a bit of Chinese, and mother in Chinese is mama. So
wow.
It's not any different really from English. Somebody hearing a child say that in Chinese would know immediately what they mean.
Yeah.
So
we would be so much poorer as human beings without the word mother, wouldn't we?
Well, I think the fact that it is that one of those few universal words across languages does reflect just how important mothers are, really.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the impact, if you like, to mothers and to children.
Yeah.
What about the impact for things like planning and government organisation? Because data is so important here, isn't it? What sort of data blips have you found where unclear language has impacted on data collection?
Well, there's a couple of issues. There's issues around lack of clarity, but there's also just issues around data collection full stop. I mean, I think, and you've had there in the UK the work of Alice Sullivan
Yeah.
showing how data collection on sex has been reducing over time, and really advocating strongly for accurate data collection. And that's extremely important, because if we don't have accurate data, then we can't plan and we can't understand what's happening in particular areas. And not having data on sex, or having inaccurate data on sex, is particularly important in any situation where there's a great divergence between the sexes. And so I think the classic example of that is, again, when it comes to prisons. We have very many more men who are in prison than women. We have very much more men disproportionately undertake violent crime. And so just a few people who are male, whose sex is misrecorded as female, can really skew data. And so we don't really necessarily know what was happening. And again, a UK example from a few years ago, there was reports of quite a large increase in the number of women who had been found guilty of undertaking a sexual crime against a child. And because of the data collection problems that you've had in the UK, where police have not necessarily been recording sex accurately, it just isn't possible to know whether that's a real increase in crime by women, or is it a statistical anomaly because people's sex has not been accurately recorded. And that's a really important thing to know if that's the case. And the other big issue is in healthcare, actually.
Yeah.
So if you don't have your sex accurately recorded, then you risk your individual healthcare, because, and there have been examples of this, if somebody's female and they're recorded as male in their health record, and they turn up at the emergency department and they've got abdominal pain, you ask different questions and do different things if it's somebody who's female versus somebody who's male. And there was a case published in a medical journal of somebody who did exactly that, and they were in fact pregnant and in labour. They had preeclampsia, which is a very serious pregnancy complication. And by the time it was discovered that this was in fact the case, there was a umbilical cord prolapse and the baby had died. So individual health is an issue, but also just within systems generally. So I've been working with some UK radiographers on the pregnancy inquiry process before X-rays, or ionising radiation exposure is the long form. But essentially, if you're going to have an X-ray and you're sort of between, a teenager to middle age and you're a woman, you'll get asked, is there any possibility that you could be pregnant? But because people's health records are not reliable anymore, NHS trusts have taken a stack of different approaches to it. And some health services, they ask everybody if they could be pregnant, regardless of what sex is in their health record and regardless of what they look like, which is upsetting lots of men and making more work for radiographers.
Yeah.
And it's just because they can't rely on people's sex being accurate. So in most health services, though, they're just basing it on people's appearances, essentially, which means that for those female patients who are identifying as trans men and have changed their records and who might look like they're male because they've been taking testosterone, there's that risk that they might be pregnant and they won't be asked about it because they haven't been identified as female and because their health record's incorrect.
I think it also means you can't take positive action to promote, say you have a particular sex that isn't being attracted to this employment or girls in science. I used to work in education. We very often had projects about girls coming into science. If you've got a class of girls and you're not counting them as girls, even though some of them are actually boys, then your data is completely unreliable.
Well, you can't. I mean, I think that was one of the arguments with the 4 Women Scotland case, wasn't it?
Mhm.
Where it was like, okay, so if we have, because the original legislation was about
About health.
boards, women on boards. And so you could have a board that was 100% male, but meet the requirement if you were considering someone a woman not based on their sex, but based on how they identified. So, which of course completely defeats the purpose of what was
Also,
being
the issue
proposed.
of if you don't have clear language, there's a whole group of people in society who, as an inclusive society, we really ought to be thinking about. Those people for whom English is a second or even a third language. That's so much more difficult, isn't it, for people to get very basic health messages if language is confused. Cervix havers. I mean, if your
Yes.
first language wasn't English, would you know what that meant?
Absolutely. And in fact, I mean, that's been one of the areas when it comes to cervical cancer screening. So, health communication, the basic principles are use the plainest, clearest language possible. And, we were talking before about, the simplicity of, the word mother, but woman is also a really, if you're learning English, the words women and man are going to be amongst the first dozen words you learn,
Mm.
they're going to be very early on. Whereas these, I think the words for internal body organs, like cervix, like uterus,
Yeah.
you are not going to learn them for a very long time.
No, well, our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, still doesn't quite understand what a cervix is. He thinks you can take a tablet and grow one.
Well, that is actually there is a real issue even with people who are native English speakers, women who don't know what a cervix is and that they
Mm.
have one. You know, because a lot of women have relatively little knowledge about their own bodies, and again, particularly internal organs that you can't see. A lot of women just don't know very much at all. And so if you're having cervical cancer screening promotion that talks about if you have a cervix, it doesn't draw the attention to even read any or try to understand what's being said because women who um, don't know what that word means, they don't know what cervix is, are not going to think this message is for me. Whereas a sign or a communication that says, this is for women 20 to, I'm not sure what the age range is actually, so 20 to 70 or something. But if you see that, then you think, oh, actually, I'm a woman and I'm within that age range. So maybe this information is relevant to me and I should pay some attention to it and take some time to work out what it's trying to say. But I mean, that is language changes happening all over the world. And in fact, I wrote to my own member of parliament last week about an example that came through saying, can I please have a meeting with the health minister or, someone from his office, because these changes are being made. And I think this is the most shocking thing almost about it all. These changes are being made without an evidence base to actually quantify what the impact is. We can look at them and go, well, these changes work against everything that we know about communication and clear communication and how best to actually get people to understand what we're trying to say and get their attention. So we know that this is likely to be detrimental at a population level, but they really have not done the work, not funded the research to understand what the impact is. There's actually a petition out at the moment in the UK from somebody asking for the UK government, to actually fund research to do this, which is a really basic, you shouldn't be making changes before the research is done. They really should have been doing this and finding out what the impact was and how best to actually communicate to everybody to make sure everybody's needs are met.
Yeah.
But yeah, it hasn't been done.
We've signed that petition, but we'll share the link when this goes out under the notes. So do you think the tide is we keep saying the tide is turning here, and I really do think it is. Do you think the tide is turning in Australia? Do you think there's some kickback against this stuff?
No, not really. No, I don't. I think that just this problem of, we also haven't had anybody do any research on this. And so absent that, people still are claiming, this is more inclusive, this is the best way to do things. And so I think until we do get some research, and there has been some done, there's a small study that was done with, I think, 13 or 14 women in the United States that found, that they really rejected some of these terms to describe breastfeeding. And there's been research that's been done in Uganda, excellent research done in Uganda with, I think, 160 people, showing that they found terms like menstruators offensive, and, birthing parents they thought meant both mothers and fathers. So that's really, great research, but it's not, a lot of people will question its applicability in places like the UK and Australia. And so we really need to be doing our own research. And I think, so not just research on communicating with the general population, but also research on communicating with transgender people. Like, these language changes have been proposed, for them, with the idea that they'll find it more acceptable. And that may be the case, but we actually don't know if they are also, this language is confusing. So are they actually understanding what is being communicated, or is this being misunderstood by them as well? Like, we really actually haven't had research to identify, what is the best possible way to communicate with this population. And, I really feel that some of the organisations that advocate for transgender people have not done their work properly. I really think that they should be advocating for this research as well as helping people to understand why their sex is important to their healthcare. I mean, they should be at the forefront, really, of saying to people, don't change your sex in your health record because you're going to compromise the quality of healthcare that you might receive.
It actually shouldn't be an individual choice, really, should it? Because
I think it's unethical. Yeah, I think it's absolutely, if you were looking at, applying ethical principles broadly, I can't see how it could be substantiated that it's ethical for health systems to allow people to change their sex in their health record.
Yeah. I know you've worked across nations, really. I know that you've reached out as part of doing your research, but also as part of, I suppose, the sisterhood. You've reached out and you've worked with women all across the world. I know that you've worked with Millie Hill, for example. Has that been important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the benefits perhaps of, what has been quite difficult in many respects is actually getting to know, principled people. Because what you're seeing, you look and you know that people understand, sometimes quite prominent people, that they understand that there's a problem here, but they won't speak. They might not go along with it. Some of them will go along with it, and, you look and you think, why are you doing that? You're actually in quite a position of authority and respect, and, you should actually be thinking about who are the people who are being impacted by this. And I do think it's the more vulnerable mothers and babies who are, and women generally. But, why are you doing that? But then there are other people who, have just been quite outspoken, and they've been advocates, and sometimes it's had a very big cost for them. But yeah, you get to see who are the people who are independent thinkers, who are the people who are principled and who are willing to do what they see as the right thing, even though it might be costly for them. And I think that's been a fantastic thing. I've really enjoyed getting to know and being connected with lots of people around the world who have, who've done just that. Who've gone, yep, I will do this thing because I think it's right to do, not because it's going to give me any benefit. And in fact, it might be very costly to me.
That's a perfect segue across back to Bex for her final question, because you've almost given us an introduction to.
Yeah, absolutely perfect. So, of course, we come to our final question, which is the same in every episode. And that is, do you have a woman or women of the moment?
So, my woman of the moment. Well, she's been a woman of many moments, actually, over many decades, in fact. And that is Marion Thompson. And I don't know if you've heard of Marion. She's an American woman. She's actually one of the founders of La Leche League International. You know, and we're talking, I think, 70 years ago, perhaps. She started it with some of her friends. It's gone to become, it's the breastfeeding, mother-to-mother breastfeeding support organisation is all around the world. Back then, when she was doing this in the 50s, was doing something quite radical. And over her life, and she's now in her late 90s, she's continued to do that. And I think, she did it during the HIV pandemic. She was advocating, hang on, you need to be thinking, is it actually the right thing to advise that women who have HIV shouldn't breastfeed? Perhaps you're not looking at this closely enough. And in fact, she turned out to be right then. And that was an absolutely heretical thing to say, because we found out in the end that if babies were being exclusively breastfed, the risk of transmission was tiny and much less risky than babies being formula fed. But in all of this, she's also spoken up and said, this is not right. These language changes are not things that we should be supporting. And within her own organisation, she tried to advocate for that. She went back on the board in her 90s to try and fix that, and was treated very badly by very many people. So I really like to honour Marion, because it's been a lifetime, I think, of advocating for mothers and babies, no matter the cost. And it's a real pleasure. She's one of those people that I've been able to connect with over this, and it's been a real pleasure to do that.
Wow, what a brave woman, and an excellent, excellent pick. I love it.
Yes, that's been marvellous. We had Ruth, didn't we, from MoMA, the breakaway organisation that formed after La Leche League started to admit men to breastfeeding meetings. She was really inspirational.
Yeah.
I think they named MoMA after Marion. So, yeah.
Oh, lovely.
Perfect.
That's been so interesting. It's fascinating. Language, fascinating.
Yeah, who would have thought? I don't think anyone thought that we'd be, talking about these things and doing these things right now. But anyway.
Yeah, when you were talking about trans people and how the language changes possibly disadvantage them as well, and I thought everybody loves being able to call their mum.
Yeah.
You would lose that. That would be terrible, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a scandal that there hasn't been research done, and it's just I don't understand it.
So we're to watch this space, and also watch this space for your paper about
my more controversial paper.
Yeah.
Well, can't wait for that. Yeah, we'll read with interest.
Well, it's been fabulous.
I'm going to have lots of people be unhappy, but that's all good. I can cope.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Karleen.
No, thanks. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I do listen. So
great.
So I was pleased to. Somebody said, I can't remember who it was who contacted me and said, they're looking for people to talk about language. You should contact. I'm like, okay, I can do that.
Tick.
Very good. Well, thank you.
Thank you to our listeners. We really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff to help keep our channel growing and spread the word. Thank you.